from a vehicle storage lot in an undisclosed location. Here's another episode of The Traditional Roman Catholic.
Hello again. Pretty quiet day here in the remote compound, maybe except for the crows, but it certainly hasn't been quiet within the Catholic Church over the last year. The summer of shame, the scandals, the controversies, the odd pronouncements coming from Rome. As Catholics, as faithful Catholics, how do we deal with this? How do we deal with the controversies? How do we deal with the Holy Father, Pope Francis? What should the strategy be going forward? That's what I'd like to talk to you about today, and just got a couple of ideas for you. And they're not really my ideas, of course. I'd like to recommend a book to you. It's called Infiltration, written by Dr. Taylor Marshall. An excellent resource, and that's something I'd like for you to consider reading, all dozen and a half of you who follow this channel. So what we're going to go through today is a strategy that can be called recognize and resist. And this is a strategy that Dr. Marshall puts forward in his book, and he's been talking about it for some time, and this is what I'm going to be doing, and I'm just going to go through the basics of it here, and maybe you'll want to do something similar. So anyway, recognize and resist. If you want to just boil it down to the nutshell elements here, there's just two of them. Number one, you recognize, however painfully, that the current pontificate is valid. And number two, you resist anyone in the hierarchy, and that includes the Holy Father, when they speak in error. Okay, so you support them, you pray for them, but when they speak in error, that's when you resist. So as part of this, some of the key elements of this is understanding that the popes and bishops from around the time of Vatican II to the present are valid. But some of them, and you know who, we don't have to name the names here, but you certainly can come up with a few on your own, have fallen into error on a variety of topics. The laity are not obliged to accept any new teaching which is contrary to the revealed doctrines and dogmas of our faith. You don't have to just march in lockstep with what's coming from your bishop's chancery or even from the Vatican if it goes against what we know as Catholics to be true. So anyway, let's take a little bit closer look at this whole recognize thing. In order for this to take this strategy, you have to pretty much come to grip with the fact that the Pope is validly elected. Yeah, there may have been irregularities associated with Benedict XVI's abdication, and there may have been some odd things that you hear about coming from the conclave that elected Pope Francis, but it's hearsay, it's rumor, and everything we have to go on, despite some of the other videos that you may see out there on YouTube from respected people, I'm saying that we have to recognize that for good or for ill, love him or hate him, that Francis is indeed our Pope. So what are your duties associated with recognizing this? Well, number one, you've got to pray for the Holy Father. You should be doing that anyway, even if he's your absolute favorite Pope of all time, or if you're really, really upset with him and just wish he'd stop. Either way, you've got to pray for him. Pray for him at Mass. When there's the intentions for the Pope during the Mass, don't cross your arms and say, I'm not doing that. Actually say something earnest for the Pope. And do the same thing in your daily devotions. A decade of the Rosary for the Pope. And it doesn't have to be for the Pope's intentions, because some of his intentions may not be that good. I mean, we've certainly see the record, but if you pray for his holy intentions, now you're basically praying that when the Pope is in alignment with the Holy Spirit, you're praying for that. One of the prayers that I say is that may he become the man that God intends him to be. And I say that for my Pope, I say that for my Bishop, who is also no gem. So as part of this, though, you have to maintain a non-sedevacantist approach. In other words, you can't say the last Pope was Pius XII, and these other guys are fakes, they're phonies, we ain't got no Pope. That's not a part of the recognize and resist strategy. That's something else entirely. So let's talk a little bit about resist. Okay, well, here's a quote from Dr. Taylor Marshall's book, Infiltration. He says, "Since no pope since 1950 has exercised his extraordinary magisterium by declaring anything infallibly ex cathedra, the Catholic," that's you, "may in good faith and conscience resist errors spoken by a pope on Twitter, on an airplane, or even in a papal document." So, if you don't know Latin, the phrase ex cathedra does not mean spoken from an Alitalia airliner at 35,000 feet. Resist. Think about Galatians 2:11. Okay, this is one of the more famous verses in the New Testament. And there we learn that St. Paul resists Peter, quote, "to his face because he was to be blamed." So, was Paul a sedevacantist? No. Did he think Peter was a bad pope? That he wasn't a valid pope? That he was a jerk? No. There was an instance, a very important instance, where Peter was just flat out wrong on the doctrines of the new church, the doctrines that had been revealed to the apostles by Christ himself. Peter was wrong, Paul corrected him. So, throughout all that, Paul recognized the authority of St. Peter as valid, but he still resists him in defense of the gospel, in defense of the magisterium. So if your parish priest, your bishop, or even your pontiff says something off the mark, you can correct them in charity. So, how do we put this recognize and resist strategy into practice? Well, number one, we've already talked about it, you pray. And number two, you study. Okay, and again, you need two things, really. You need to understand what your faith really and genuinely teaches you. A couple of prelates that I respect, and many of you do, put out a pretty succinct restatement of what the Catholic faith really teaches, what it has always taught, and you can find it online, and if you go to CatholicCyber-Militia.com, we'll have a link there where you can find that document, but that will dispel for you a lot of the confusion that has been sown over the last few years concerning what it is we're supposed to believe. You can obviously go to the Catechism of the Catholic Church, maybe before the pen and ink changes started coming in that they're a little shaky, but the Catechism from the Council of Trent, the Catechism that teaches the fundamental truths of our faith and have consistently taught those truths right from the beginning. So you have to understand what it is really to be a Catholic, what the doctrines are, not what the trends are that are being forced on the church in an effort to become modern, okay, or things being spoken by celebrity priests who want the church to change radically, or German bishops who want us to become some kind of neo-pagan outfit in order to make people in the Amazon happy. Okay, you have to understand what your doctrine is. You also have to understand how we got into this mess in the first place. It didn't just begin with the election of the current pope. It didn't just begin with the suppression of the traditional Latin Mass when the Novus Ordo came along. It didn't begin in Vatican II. It began long before that, and like Dr. Marshall says, Vatican II is pretty much a victory lap. So this is a good go-to source. It's got chronologies, timelines. It's thoroughly footnoted. It's a really, really good read to give you, maybe take 2 or 3 days to go through it. The history of the church, really from about the 19th century when things started going south to the present day. So there's 2 things you have to know. You have to understand what your faith actually teaches you, and you have to understand the nature of the crisis. And it is a crisis. So then the final thing, you've got to pray some more. And some very powerful prayers there. The rosary, if you can't say an entire rosary for the church in the midst of her crisis, say a decade. say a prayer for the church that she will remain sanctified and that she will stand firm with the true teachings that we have from the apostles, and pray for the Holy Father. Pray very, very hard for the Holy Father that that God will make him into the kind of man that he truly wants him to be. So there you have it. Recognize and resist.